Alright, this week we are going to be talking about the integumentary system. This is going to be the system that consists of your outer body covering. So we're going to be talking about your skin and the accessory structures that go with your skin. So if you look at the integumentary system, it's pretty big. So it's going to be made up of two major groups: your cutaneous membrane, so that's like your skin, and then these accessory structures, which are going to be your hair follicles, exocrine glands like sweat glands, and then your nails. On that cutaneous membrane, it's going to be made up of the epidermis and the dermis, and it has a whole lot of different functions. One, it is a huge protective covering. So what does your skin protect you from? Well, it's going to protect you from UV radiation, right? It's going to protect you from chemicals. If you spill a chemical in your skin, you have buffers built in that actually neutralize those chemicals. So if you spill an acid or a base, your blood has it, which is in the dermis, and it will protect your body from that. It protects you from abrasion and contact, so it's kind of cushiony, and if you get a scratch, it will heal over. So chemical, physical, ultraviolet, a whole lot of different ways that your skin protects you. It also protects you from thermal damage, so from heat. If you start getting too hot, those vessels will dilate. And that's one way that it regulates your body temperature, is by dilating the vessels near the surface, and that will let off heat that is trapped inside your body. Retards water loss. You do not lose or absorb water through your skin. So if you're thirsty, you can't sit in a bathtub and have that take care of your thirst, unless you're drinking the bathtub water, which is different, right? So your skin is really good at retarding water loss or stopping water from being lost through it. It also houses your sensory receptors. You have touch receptors, you have hot receptors, you have cold receptors. Your hairs have receptors, so sometimes you don't even have to touch something. You can just come close enough and touch your hairs, and you'd be like, I felt that. And it synthesizes biochemicals. One that it synthesizes is vitamin D. So when you go out in the sun, you get vitamin D being produced. Something that happens up at the ends of the poles, so up near Alaska or down around Antarctica. During the winter, when the sun doesn't shine for 3 months, people have to go in and have solar therapies or light therapy, where they go and they sit in a tanning bed and make vitamin D. It also helps with sadness. But what vitamin D does is it's important in healthy bones. If you look at your milk, it might say that it's been enriched with vitamin D, because milk has a lot of calcium, and you're supposed to drink milk for strong bones, right? And so that vitamin D helps to make strong bones. And then lastly, hidden by my face over here, is excretion. What does your skin excrete? Well, it excretes sweat. And what's in sweat? Mostly it's water. Probably the next thing is going to be salt. So you can taste your sweat. I don't know if you've ever been working out or just out somewhere hot and you get sweat build up on your upper lip and you're like, you lick it, right? It's salty. Something else that you find in sweat is urea. Urea is a nitrogenous waste. You make that whenever you break down proteins and amino acids. Urea is the stuff that you find in urine or pee. So if you've ever licked that salt off your upper lip, now you know what pee tastes like. Not really, though, because that's a lot saltier than your pee should be. I don't know. I've never tried, but I'm going to assume. So talking about that cutaneous membrane, we're going to focus firstly on this uppermost layer. This is the epidermis. Epi means on top of or above, and so you're going to find the epidermis above or on top of the dermis. So it's going to be our most superficial layer. That's the layer you can see, right? It is composed mostly of stratified squamous epithelium. So all of these cells right through here are your stratified squamous cells. And so once you get to the top, they're going to be those little squishy, flat cells, right? It also has the stratified squamous cells. They're specifically called keratinocytes because they make keratin. Especially in this stratum granulosum, you can see they start making a bunch of keratin, and keratin's that protein that gives your skin its strength, its durability. Some non-stratified squamous cells that you can find in there will be like Langerhans cells. These are a type of macrophage. So they're a monocyte that has come from the blood and traveled to the epidermis to attack. If you get like any abrasions or something, it's going to be your first line of defense there. You also have melanocytes down here. These things reach out and deposit melanin, a pigment, a brownish pigment that protects the nuclei of these stratified squamous cells from UV radiation by absorbing it. So there are various strata. I mentioned the stratum granulosum already, but starting from the bottom, you have the stratum basal, or the basal layer. And we'll go through these layers a little bit more in detail as we move through. And then you have your stratum spinosum, or the spiny layer. Your spinosum, and then your stratum granulosum, the grainy layer. Your stratum lucidum, or the clear layer, and then your stratum corneum, the horny layer. So in that stratum basal, or the basal layer, it's going to be your deepest layer of the epidermis, okay? Not of the dermis, of the epidermis. It's really tightly attached to the dermis down here. And when we get to the dermis, we'll talk about these dermal papillae. They're kind of like these finger-like projections that go up and down between the dermis and the epidermis and cause these friction ridges. And this layer is where you will find the melanocytes. And this is the layer that is actively dividing. This is the layer that is closest to the blood supply. So if you remember, epithelial tissue, like this stratified squamous, don't have any blood vessels of their own. They don't have any nerves of their own. And so that's all down here in this connective tissue of the dermis. And so this is the layer that is closest to that blood, to the nutrients. And so it's able to be mitotically active. It's able to divide often. And so all these cells that you see up here come from this bottom layer of cells. The next layer is the stratum spinosum, or the spiny layer. It's called the spiny layer because when we are histologically preparing slides, they go through a drying process. I don't know if you watched the slide prep video from lab, but it goes through a drying process. And what that drying process does is it causes these cells to kind of shrink. And these desmosomes are contacts between the cells that hold really, really tight. And so when those cells start shrinking, those desmosomes are still holding tight, and it makes this look like each cell is kind of like a little porcupine when it shrivels up. And so it looked really spiny when they first looked at it, and so they call it the spiny layer, or the stratum spinosum. There is still some mitosis in this layer because it's not too far away from this single layer of the basal, and so you'll still see some mitosis. You can probably still see some melanocytes, but not much. This tends to be a pretty thick layer too. Then moving up, we get to the granulosum, or this grainy layer right here. They start forming these keratin granules. The cells are no longer dividing. They're too far away from the blood supply by now, And so these cells are starting to die. And part of that dying process is to make these keratin granules to give your skin that extra strength and waterproofing that it needs. And then only in really thick skin will you see the stratum lucidum, or this clear layer. Most of your skin, you're probably not going to find the stratum lucidum. So areas where you have thick skin, your hands, your feet, so in your palms and the soles of your feet, that's about the thickest skin you have. And then we get to the upper layer, the stratum corneum. So looking at this slide right here, so here you can see those dermal papillae reaching up. So this is the basal layer. All of this is the spiny layer. Here's your granulosum. And then all of this is corneum. So this is pretty thick skin. It has a really thick layer of this corneum. We call this the horny layer because these cells are all dead and made of keratin. And keratin is the same stuff that makes up the horns of cows. And so it's not called the horny layer because you touch it and get horny. It's called the horny layer because it has keratin, which is the same stuff that makes horns. So the fact that these cells are dead, squished flat, filled with keratin, there's no water to be lost, right? And it's going to take a lot for water to get through all of this stuff. There's some glycolipids in here that also prevent water from being absorbed. So the stratum corneum, the upper layer of the epidermis, these are dead cells. I don't know if you were ever a kid and took something like a needle and like put it through like just the tip of your finger, just through that top layer of skin. And it doesn't hurt because it's dead, right? There's no nerves there. And so you can do that. Kind of like when you get your hair cut. It doesn't hurt because those cells are dead. So how long does it take for a cell to go from this bottom layer to this top layer? About 14 days. So about 2 weeks, you're going to have a cell move from the basal layer up to the corneum and die. And then it hangs on for about 2 more weeks. What happens to it after that? Well, it gets shed or sloughed off. And then it ends up as dust in your house. Most of the dust in your house is made up of dead skin cells. That's kind of gross. Makes you want to dust more often. So, in about a month, you will have brand new skin. So how long does it take for a cut to heal? Well, depending on how deep it is, it should be healed in a month, because you can make a whole new skin in a month. Alright, so the layers again, real quick. Starting from the top, corneum. And you can see the lucidum right here, kind of this off purple color. There's a good spot of lucidum. So this is a really thick skin. Then the granulosum, just the area that has the grainy looking texture to it. This is all the spinosum, and then just one layer of the basal. Something that you see are these friction ridges right here when you have really thick skin like this. Again, we said you find thick skin on your hands and your feet. These friction ridges are showing how these dermal papillae are reaching up, right? If you look at them, they go together. So where the papillae reach up, you're going to have a friction ridge. This is really important. This holds the dermis to the epidermis. So take your hands, put them like that. You can slide them back and forth pretty easy. But what the friction ridge is it acts kind of like a fist and you cup it. Now you try to slide those back and forth. It's not going to happen. It's going to hold that dermis to the epidermis. Can you force the two apart? Of course you can. With a lot of friction you can. If you've ever had a blister, that is when you force these two apart. With with a lot of friction, you can pull the two apart, and then you're going to end up with a little hole there. That hole, or that gap that formed, is going to have to grow new skin. In the meantime, though, it fills up with lymphatic fluid, or body fluid, right? And if it gets infected, you can have pus leak out of it and lots of cool stuff like that. So these friction ridges are meant to hold them together. And you can actually see the friction ridges if you look at your hands and your feet. This is what gives you your fingerprints. It's really cool stuff. So let's look at another slide. This one's stained a little bit differently. And so again, here you can see the dermal papillae reaching up, that basal layer, spinosum. This granulosum shows up really well with this stain. And then everything above is the corneum. Alright, so below the epidermis is going to be the dermis. That dermis is made up of connective tissue. It's going to bind the epidermis to everything below it. And the dermis is where you're going to find your blood vessels. It's also where you're going to find your hair follicles, your sebaceous glands and your sweat glands, your nerve fibers, both your motor and your sensory. So your motor fibers, we'll talk more about this when we get into the nervous system. But they're your efferent fibers. They're the ones going out to effectors. Effectors are things like glands and muscles. Then your sensory fibers are going to be afferent or afferent, going towards the central nervous system, and they're going to be the ones carrying sensory information. Okay. And so when we look at this, you can see the two layers of the dermis. You have this papillary layer where you find those dermal papillae, and then you go down to where the most of it is with this reticular layer. So papillary is going to be the superficial layer of the dermis. Reticular is going to be the deep layer of the dermis. And if you look at the types of tissue there, they're very different. And then below the dermis, you have the subcutaneous layer, sometimes abbreviated sub-Q, also known as your hypodermis. So in this hypodermis, this is where you're going to find a lot of fat. So if you go back to this picture, you can see lots of adipocytes in here, lots of blood vessels in here, and then they reach up with smaller vessels closer to that surface. So you're going to have your capillaries right up here near that basal layer so they can get a lot of the nutrients and do that cell division. Alright, so that's it for the cutaneous membrane. We're going to talk a little bit about skin color in the next one, and the accessory structures.